I didn't hesitate when my sister called me crying. Her marriage had ended the way so many do, quietly, officially, with paperwork instead of shouting. She said she needed somewhere temporary. She promised she wouldn't be a burden. She reminded me, gently, that family shows up when it matters. So I said yes. At the time, it felt like generosity. It felt like maturity. It felt like the kind of decision women like me are praised for: selfless, steady, dependable. I didn't ask my daughter how she felt. Not because I didn't care, but because I assumed children adapt. That assumption would cost me more than I knew. The first night my sister moved in, the house felt fuller. Louder. Familiar in a way that made me nostalgic and uneasy at the same time. She brought boxes, stories, and a quiet bitterness she tried to hide behind humor. My daughter stayed in her room. I told myself she was being polite. I told myself it would pass. I told myself many things. At first, nothing felt wrong. That's the part people don't understand when they ask later why I didn't notice sooner. They imagine a single moment, something sharp, obvious, undeniable. But life rarely announces itself that way. Most damage arrives softly, disguised as adjustment. My sister settled in like someone who planned to stay longer than she admitted. She reorganized the pantry to help. Moved furniture an inch at a time. Took over the kitchen without asking, cooking meals I didn't request, leaving behind the faint impression that I was now a guest in my own routines. I told myself she needed control because she'd lost so much. I told myself I was strong enough to make space. What I didn't tell myself, what I avoided even thinking, was how carefully my daughter was watching all of it. She was 13 then. Old enough to notice tone. Old enough to feel shifts without needing explanations. Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. Until next time. Young enough to believe those shifts were her fault. She stopped lingering in common rooms. At first, I barely noticed. I was busy mediating small things: who used which bathroom, whose turn it was to do laundry, how to keep conversations light so my sister wouldn't spiral back into tears. When my daughter came home from school, she went straight to her room. She's just at that age, my sister said once, casually. Teenagers pull away. I nodded. It was easier than listening more closely. Dinner changed. We used to eat together most nights, nothing formal, just shared space, shared silence. But now my sister talked through meals, filling the air with stories about her divorce, her ex-husband's failures, her uncertainty about the future. I watched my daughter push food around her plate, eyes down, shoulders tight. Did anything happen at school today? I asked once. She shrugged. Not really. And I let that be enough. I didn't notice when she stopped asking me questions. I didn't notice when she stopped telling me small things: what book she was reading, which teacher annoyed her, who she sat next to at lunch. The house was full. But something essential had gone missing. My sister had opinions, constant, unfiltered. About my parenting. About my daughter's clothes. About how much screen time was too much. About how kids today were too sensitive. She needs thicker skin, she said once, laughing lightly, when my daughter retreated to her room after a comment I hadn't heard clearly. I smiled weakly. I should have asked what was said. I didn't. Because asking would have required choosing. And at that point, I was still pretending no choice was being asked of me. The first time my daughter stopped speaking to me for an entire evening, I told myself she was tired. She answered questions with nods. One-word replies. Avoided my eyes. I knocked on her door before bed. Everything okay? I asked. She hesitated. Then she said, yeah. That pause should have undone me. Instead, I said goodnight. I thought love was patience. I didn't realize patience can become neglect when it's used to avoid discomfort. Weeks passed. My sister grew more comfortable. Louder. Freer with her criticisms. She corrected my daughter openly now, how she spoke, how she stood, how she reacted. "Don't be dramatic," she said once, dismissively. I was in the other room. I heard it. And I stayed silent. Not because I agreed, but because I didn't want to escalate things. Because I believed keeping the peace was protecting everyone. That night, my daughter didn't come out for dinner. I brought a plate to her room. She took it without looking at me. Our fingers brushed. She flinched. That moment sat in my chest long after I walked away. Something was wrong. I finally admitted that to myself, not fully, not bravely, but enough to feel uneasy. Still, I did nothing. Because acknowledging harm is easy. Interrupting it is not. My sister began referring to the house as ours. She said it casually, laughing, but every time she did, my stomach tightened. I noticed my daughter flinch too. She doesn't mean anything by it, I told myself. She's just adjusting. But my daughter was adjusting too. Adjusting by disappearing. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, too quiet. I heard voices in the kitchen. My sister's voice. Sharp. Controlled. Then my daughter's. Soft. Shaky. I stopped walking. I stood there, unseen, listening to words that were not meant for me but were meant to shape her. And in that stillness, I realized something terrifying. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a pattern. And I had been allowing it. I didn't walk into the kitchen. I stood there, frozen, my hand still on my bag, my coat half slipped off my shoulder. My sister's voice was calm. Controlled. The kind of calm that sounds reasonable if you don't know how to listen for what's underneath. "I'm just saying," she said, "you can't take everything so personally. That's why you get upset all the time." There was a pause. Then my daughter spoke. "I wasn't upset," she said. "I just." "You were," my sister cut in. "You always are. You need to learn how to manage that." Another pause. I waited for my daughter to argue. She didn't. She said nothing. That silence did something to me. It pressed against my ribs in a way I couldn't ignore. I finally stepped forward, letting my keys make noise against the counter so my presence wouldn't feel like an ambush. Both of them turned. My sister smiled. "Easy. Familiar. Oh, hey. You're home early." My daughter didn't look at me. She was staring at the floor. I should have asked what was happening. Instead, I asked, "Everything okay?" My sister nodded immediately. "Of course. We were just talking." My daughter stayed quiet. That should have been enough information. But I let it pass. Again. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. I could hear the house settling, the familiar sounds of walls shifting and pipes ticking. Sounds that had always comforted me. Now they felt like reminders. I thought about the years I'd spent telling myself that peace was something you preserved by staying calm, by staying reasonable, by not making a fuss. I wondered when calm had started to look so much like silence. The next morning, my daughter left without saying goodbye. She used to. I told myself she was running late. I told myself I was overthinking. Overthinking was easier than confronting the truth taking shape in front of me. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing details I'd previously smoothed over. The way my sister corrected my daughter's tone but never mine. The way she framed criticism as concern. "I'm just worried about her confidence," she'd say, after commenting on how sensitive she was. The way my daughter started asking permission to do things she never used to ask about, getting a snack, using the living room, playing music softly. That one hurt the most. I watched her hesitate in her own home. And I did nothing. Not because I didn't care, but because doing something would mean admitting I had already failed her. There's a particular kind of fear that comes with realizing harm has been happening on your watch. It doesn't shout. It whispers. It says, if you intervene now, you'll have to face how long you waited. So I stayed still. I tried to compensate in other ways. I brought my daughter small treats. Asked if she wanted to watch something together. Offered rides even when she usually walked. She declined most of it politely. Her distance wasn't dramatic. It was measured. like someone conserving energy. One evening, my sister and I argued quietly in the kitchen after my daughter went to bed. "She's rude," my sister said flatly. "She rolls her eyes. She shuts down. That's not normal." "She's a kid," I said. "She's going through things." My sister sighed, as if I were the one being difficult. "You're too close to it. You always excuse her." That sentence landed harder than she intended. Because it wasn't just criticism of my daughter. It was criticism of me. And I realized then how subtly my authority had been eroded. Not taken. Handed over. The next morning, I found my daughter sitting at the kitchen table before school, staring at her cereal. She didn't look up when I entered. I poured coffee and sat across from her. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said, very quietly, "Do you want her here more than you want me comfortable?" The question was so direct it knocked the air out of me. I stared at her. "What?" I said. She kept her eyes on the table. "It's okay if you do. I just want to know." I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Because any answer that wasn't an immediate, unequivocal no would be a betrayal. And any answer that was an immediate, unequivocal no would require action I hadn't taken yet. She stood up before I could respond. "I'm late," she said, grabbing her bag. She paused at the door. "I'll just stay out of the way," she added. "It's easier." And then she left. I sat there long after the door closed. My coffee went untouched. That sentence echoed in my head all day. "I'll just stay out of the way." That wasn't teenage drama. That was adaptation. That was a child learning how to disappear to survive an adult's comfort. That night, I finally cried. Not loudly. Not cathartically. Just tears sliding down my face while I sat on the edge of my bed, realizing something irreversible had already happened. My daughter had stopped trusting me to protect her. And trust, once broken quietly, doesn't shatter. It erodes. I knew then that doing nothing was no longer neutral. It was a decision. And it was costing me something I couldn't replace. The moment didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no shouting. No tears. No dramatic confrontation that forced my hand. It arrived quietly, on a weekday afternoon, disguised as something ordinary. I was folding laundry in the living room when I noticed my daughter's backpack by the door. It was earlier than usual for her to be home. Too early. I heard voices in the kitchen again. My sister's voice carried first, light, almost cheerful. "You can't keep doing things halfway," she said. "If you're going to try, at least do it properly." Then my daughter's. Small. Tight. "I did what you said." A pause. "Well, then you didn't listen carefully," my sister replied. "That's part of the problem." I stopped folding. I didn't move this time. I didn't make noise. I didn't announce myself. I stood there, heart pounding, and I listened. "You always twist things," my sister continued. "When someone points something out, you shut down instead of learning." "I'm not shutting down," my daughter said. "I just don't like being talked to like that." There it was. Clear. Calm. A boundary. And my sister stepped right over it. "If you don't like it," she said, "then maybe you should be less sensitive. The world isn't going to cater to your feelings." Silence. Not the awkward kind. The kind that follows surrender. I waited for my daughter to respond. She didn't. I stepped into the kitchen then. My sister turned, surprised, but recovered quickly. "Oh," she said lightly. "We were just discussing her homework." My daughter looked at me. And in her eyes, I saw something that broke me open. Not anger. Not fear. Resignation. She wasn't asking me to intervene anymore. She was watching to see if I would. That realization landed heavier than any accusation ever could. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I said, "I need to talk to you. Now." My sister blinked. "About what?" "About how you speak to my child." The room went still. My sister's expression tightened, not with guilt, but irritation. "I'm helping her," she said. "You're too soft with her. She needs structure." I looked at my daughter. She was staring at the counter again. I turned back to my sister. No, I said quietly. She needs respect. My sister scoffed. You're overreacting. And that was it. Not the words themselves, but how easily she dismissed my reality. How familiar that dismissal felt. I took a breath. You're not her parent, I said. And you don't get to decide how she's spoken to in her own home. My sister crossed her arms. So now I'm the villain? I didn't answer that. I need you to stop correcting her, I continued. Stop commenting on her emotions. And stop undermining me. She laughed once, sharply. This is ridiculous. Maybe it was. But for the first time, I didn't feel the need to convince her. This is what I need, I said. If you're going to stay here. That word, stay, hung between us. My sister's face changed. You're choosing her over me, she said. I didn't hesitate. Yes. The word surprised me with its steadiness. She stared at me like she didn't recognize me. My daughter lifted her head. Her eyes met mine. And in that moment, something shifted, not completely, not magically, but enough to matter. My sister shook her head. I didn't realize I was such a burden. I didn't say that. You don't have to, she replied. I hear what you're saying. She grabbed her purse and walked out. The door closed behind her with a finality that echoed through the house. I stood there, trembling. Not from fear. From release. I turned to my daughter. She was watching me carefully, like someone approaching a bridge they weren't sure would hold. I'm sorry, I said. I should have listened sooner. She nodded. That was all. No hug. No tears. Just acknowledgement. And that, I understood, was all she could offer right now. Trust doesn't return because you ask for it. It returns because you prove it's safe to do so. The house felt different immediately. Not emptier. Quieter. The kind of quiet that lets you hear yourself think and sometimes, hear what you've been avoiding. My sister didn't come back that night. Or the next. She sent a message 2 days later. I think it's best if I find somewhere else to stay for a while. I need space. I read it carefully. There was no apology. No reflection. Just distance framed as dignity. I replied simply. I understand. Let me know when you want to collect the rest of your things. She didn't respond. And for the first time since she'd arrived, I didn't feel compelled to chase the silence. My daughter moved differently after that. Not dramatically. Not suddenly open. But she stopped shrinking. She came into the kitchen again. Sat on the couch with her legs tucked under her. Left her bedroom door open in the evenings. Small signs. Careful ones. The kind trust offers before it commits. I didn't push. I didn't ask for forgiveness repeatedly or demand closeness. I focused on consistency. On being present without hovering. On showing, quietly, that the boundary I'd set wasn't temporary. That it wouldn't dissolve with discomfort. Weeks passed. My sister collected her belongings in short, efficient visits when my daughter was at school. We spoke politely. Cautiously. Like people navigating something fragile. She never acknowledged what happened. She didn't need to. Her absence said enough. Family reactions filtered in slowly. A cousin asked if everything was okay. An aunt hinted that my sister had felt judged. I listened. I didn't explain. For years, I had over-explained. Now I let the narrative belong to whoever needed it. At home, the work was quieter and harder. One night, while washing dishes together, my daughter said suddenly, I didn't think you'd actually say anything. I looked at her. What do you mean? To her, she said. I thought you'd just let it go. That sentence hurt more than anything my sister had ever said. I almost did, I admitted. And I'm sorry for that. She nodded, accepting the truth without commentary. I didn't want to make things harder for you, she said. She was already upset. There it was. The inheritance I hadn't meant to pass down. The belief that children should manage adult emotions. I turned off the water. You're not responsible for keeping adults comfortable, I said. Especially not at your own expense. She didn't reply. But later that night, she knocked on my door. Can I sit with you for a bit? She asked. We didn't talk much. We just Saturday. And that was enough. My sister found a place across town. She didn't tell me where. I heard through family. She told people she needed independence. I let her have that story. Independence, I'd learned, looks different depending on who's losing control. Over time, my sister's influence faded, not dramatically, not vindictively, but naturally. She wasn't present to comment, to correct, to reshape. And without that pressure, my daughter unfolded at her own pace. She laughed more, spoke freely, took up space again. I noticed how often I'd been watching her before, monitoring her reactions, anticipating conflict. Now, I relaxed. And she noticed that too. One evening, months later, she said, "The house feels calmer." I smiled. "It does." She hesitated. "It feels like ours again." That word ours landed differently now. Not as possession. As belonging. My sister and I didn't fully reconcile. We didn't have to. Our relationship shifted into something distant but civil. She still believed she'd been misunderstood. I no longer needed her to understand. That was part of the healing. I realized then that consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like distance. Like boundaries that hold. Like relationships that change shape when control is removed. And in that change, clarity settles in. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It surfaced slowly, through patterns I started noticing only after the noise quieted. Without my sister in the house, I had space, real space, to reflect. Not the kind you fill with problem solving, but the kind that lets memories rise without being summoned. I started thinking about our childhood. About how my sister had always been the loud one. The organizer. The one who knew what everyone should be doing. She had opinions about everything, how the house should look, how conversations should go, how emotions should be handled. I used to think that meant she was confident. Now, I wondered. I remembered how our mother had been loving, but anxious. How she worried constantly about appearances. How she believed stability came from control, not flexibility. How feelings were managed quietly, privately, and only after everything else had been taken care of. My sister had absorbed that lesson fully. I had absorbed it differently. I had learned to smooth. To accommodate. To disappear when things got tense. We were raised in the same house, but we learned opposite survival strategies. Once I saw that, so much made sense. My sister didn't move into my home looking for refuge. She moved in looking for authority. And I had given it to her without realizing it. Not because she demanded it, but because I had been trained to step aside when someone else seemed more certain. I noticed the same pattern in smaller moments. At work, I often deferred even when I knew better. In friendships, I took on the role of listener, mediator, emotional sponge. I had mistaken being easy for being kind. And kindness, I was learning, requires discernment. A few weeks after my sister moved out, I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store, someone who had known us when we were children. She looked surprised to see me. "I heard things changed at your house," she said cautiously. I waited. She hesitated, then continued. "Your sister's always been strong-willed." That was the word people used when they didn't want to say controlling. I nodded. "She was like that even as a child," the woman added. "Always taking charge. Your mother relied on her more than she should have." That sentence stayed with me long after we parted. Relied on her. I thought about how early my sister had been given responsibility that didn't belong to her. How often children who are made responsible too young grow into adults who don't know how to release control. I didn't feel sympathy that erased harm. But I felt clarity. And clarity allowed me to stop personalizing everything. My sister hadn't targeted my daughter because she disliked her. She had done it because she didn't know how to exist without managing the emotional temperature of the room. My daughter, sensitive and observant, had become the easiest place to exert that control. And I had allowed it because I didn't yet trust my own authority. That realization was painful. But it was also freeing. Because it meant the pattern wasn't inevitable. It was learned. And learned things can be unlearned. I started noticing how often women are asked to inherit emotional labor without consent. How often we're taught that love looks like tolerance, and strength looks like endurance. How rarely we're taught that boundaries are a form of care. I had passed something down to my daughter without meaning to. But I could also interrupt it. That knowledge shifted how I moved through the world. I stopped apologizing for taking up space. Stopped explaining my decisions before they were questioned. Stopped offering comfort at the cost of my own clarity. At home, I named things more directly. If something felt wrong, I said so. If I needed quiet, I asked for it. If my daughter seemed withdrawn, I checked in without assuming, without minimizing. One night, as we sat together on the couch, she said, "You're different now." I smiled softly. "How so?" "You don't disappear anymore," she said. That sentence mattered more than anything my sister could ever say. Because it meant my daughter saw me not just as a parent, but as a person with boundaries. Someone she could model herself after. The past didn't disappear. Family history doesn't dissolve just because you understand it. But it loosens its grip. I no longer felt responsible for managing my sister's discomfort. Or my mother's legacy. Or anyone else's expectations. Understanding had replaced guilt. And that was the beginning of real freedom. For a long time, my life had been contained by the house. Not physically, I went to work, ran errands, kept obligations, but emotionally. Everything important seemed to orbit that space. Who felt comfortable there? Who needed accommodating? Who might be upset if things shifted? Once my sister left, that gravitational pull loosened. At first, the change felt subtle. I noticed it in how my evenings unfolded. I didn't rush home with the same tightness in my chest. I didn't brace myself for tension when I turned the key in the door. The house no longer felt like something I had to manage. It felt like a place I returned to. That distinction mattered more than I expected. I began saying yes to things I'd once declined out of habit. An invitation to walk after work. A small community class held one evening a week. Coffee with a colleague I'd always liked but never made time for. None of it felt dramatic. But each choice nudged my life outward. My daughter noticed too. She started asking if she could have friends over again, something she'd stopped doing when my sister moved in. The house filled with quiet laughter, with music playing softly in the background. I let it happen. I didn't monitor. I trusted the space. I trusted myself. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, I realized how long it had been since I'd moved without purpose. Without a list. Without a role to fulfill. I walked simply because I wanted to. The air felt different when I wasn't rushing through it. I noticed small things, the way light hit windows at different times of day, the way people moved through their routines, unaware of how much they mirrored one another. I felt untethered. Not in a lost way. In a free one. I enrolled in a short writing workshop at the community center. I didn't tell anyone why. I just wanted a space that belonged to me. In that room, with people who didn't know my family history or my patterns of accommodation, I spoke differently. I listened differently. I wasn't managing anyone's comfort. I was simply present. That presence changed how others responded to me. People leaned in when I spoke. They asked questions. Not because I demanded attention, but because I wasn't apologizing for my voice anymore. At home, the change showed up in quieter ways. I rearranged the living room not to create space for others, but to suit how I lived. I moved chairs closer to the window. Let light dictate the layout instead of expectations. My daughter helped. She chose a lamp she liked. Hung artwork that reflected her taste. The house became collaborative. Not controlled. I began saying yes to things I'd once declined out of habit. An invitation to walk after work. A small community class held one evening a week. Coffee with a colleague I'd always liked but never made time for. None of it felt dramatic. But each choice nudged my life outward. My daughter noticed too. She started asking if she could have friends over again, something she'd stopped doing when my sister moved in. The house filled with quiet laughter, with music playing softly in the background. I let it happen. I didn't monitor. I trusted the space. I trusted myself. One afternoon, while walking through the neighborhood, I realized how long it had been since I'd moved without purpose. Without a list. Without a role to fulfill. I walked simply because I wanted to. The air felt different when I wasn't rushing through it. I noticed small things, the way light hit windows at different times of day, the way people moved through their routines, unaware of how much they mirrored one another. I felt untethered. Not in a lost way. In a free one. I enrolled in a short writing workshop at the community center. I didn't tell anyone why. I just wanted a space that belonged to me. In that room, with people who didn't know my family history or my patterns of accommodation, I spoke differently. I listened differently. I wasn't managing anyone's comfort. I was simply present. That presence changed how others responded to me. People leaned in when I spoke. They asked questions. Not because I demanded attention, but because I wasn't apologizing for my voice anymore. At home, the change showed up in quieter ways. I rearranged the living room not to create space for others, but to suit how I lived. I moved chairs closer to the window. Let light dictate the layout instead of expectations. My daughter helped. She chose a lamp she liked. Hung artwork that reflected her taste. The house became collaborative. Not controlled. One evening, as we cooked dinner together, she said, "It feels like we're a team again." I swallowed hard. "We are," I said. And I meant it. I also noticed how differently I handled family communication. When my sister texted brief, neutral, I responded politely but didn't extend the conversation. I didn't invite emotional processing. I didn't offer reassurance. I let distance do its work. Some people interpret boundaries as punishment. I knew better. Boundaries are clarity. And clarity is kind. As my world expanded, I realized something else. I had been confusing availability with love. I had believed that being present for everyone else was proof of my worth. Now, I saw how love deepens when it's chosen, not assumed. My daughter thrived in that environment. Her grades improved. Her laughter returned. She spoke more freely at the dinner table. Not because I had fixed everything, but because she no longer had to guard herself. I noticed my own energy returning. I slept better. I thought more clearly. I laughed without the undercurrent of vigilance. Life hadn't become easier, but it had become lighter. And that lightness allowed me to look inward in a way I hadn't before. For most of my life, I had treated solitude like a warning sign. Empty evenings meant something was missing. Quiet rooms felt like evidence of failure. I filled silence quickly with plans, with obligations, with other people's needs, because I believed stillness was something to escape. But once my world expanded, something unexpected happened. I stopped being afraid of quiet. It began on a night when my daughter was staying over at a friend's house. The first time in a long while that the house was truly empty. I cooked dinner for one. I didn't rush. Didn't multitask. Didn't turn on the television just to fill the air. I ate slowly, noticing how different food tasted when I wasn't monitoring someone else's mood. Afterward, I sat on the couch with a book and realized I was breathing more deeply than usual. Nothing was wrong. Nothing was demanded of me. And for the first time, I understood the difference. Loneliness feels like absence pressing in on you, like a question you're failing to answer. Solitude felt like space opening around me. There was no accusation in it. Only permission. I began choosing quiet on purpose. Not every night. Not as a retreat. But as a reset. I'd sit by the window in the evenings, watching the neighborhood settle. Lights flickering on. Cars pulling into driveways. Lives continuing. Parallel but separate. I felt connected without being consumed. That balance was new. I noticed how often women are taught to fear being alone, as if our value requires constant witness. As if independence is something to apologize for. I stopped apologizing. At first, I filled my solitude with productivity, organizing, planning, making lists. Then I let that go too. I learned how to simply be present. Some nights, memories surfaced. Old conversations. Moments I wished I'd handled differently. Times I'd stayed quiet when I shouldn't have. I didn't push them away. I let them pass through, like weather. Without judgment. Grief softened in that space. So did regret. I realized how often loneliness is born not from being alone, but from being unseen, especially by yourself. Now, I was paying attention. I was listening. And in that listening, something steady formed. A sense of self that didn't need constant reinforcement. I wasn't isolating. I was integrating. One evening, my daughter came home early from her friend's house. She paused in the doorway, surprised to see me sitting quietly, a candle lit on the table. "You okay?" she asked. "I'm good," I said. She smiled. "You seem calm." I smiled back. "I am." She sat with me for a while. We didn't talk much. We didn't need to. Solitude, I learned, isn't about being alone. It's about being whole. Growth doesn't announce itself when it's finished. It waits. And then it tests you. The test arrived on an ordinary afternoon, wrapped in a familiar tone. My sister called. I hadn't heard her voice in months. She sounded careful. Softer than before. "I've been thinking," she said. "About everything." I listened without interrupting. "I know things got complicated," she continued. "I don't want distance between us forever." There it was. Not an apology. An invitation to renegotiate. In the past, I would have leaned forward immediately eager, relieved, ready to smooth things over. I would have offered reassurance, minimized harm, taken responsibility for restoring balance. This time, I stayed still. "I'm open to having a relationship," I said slowly. "But it would need to be different." She hesitated. "Different how?" I thought about my daughter. About the quiet strength that had returned to her posture. About the way trust had rebuilt itself one consistent moment at a time. "It would need to respect my role as a parent," I said. "And my boundaries." Silence stretched between us. Then she sighed. "You've changed." "Yes," I said again. "I have." She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She said she needed time to think. We ended the call politely. When I hung up, I noticed something immediately. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't replaying the conversation in my head, searching for mistakes. I wasn't bracing for fallout. The pattern had appeared. And I hadn't stepped back into it. That evening, my daughter asked who had called. "My sister," I said. She looked at me, unreadable. "How was it?" "Calm," I replied. "And unfinished." She nodded. "That sounds better." It was. Not because everything was resolved. But because nothing was denied. Old habits still surfaced in quieter ways. I caught myself over-explaining at work once, then stopped mid-sentence. I noticed the urge to smooth over a friend's discomfort, then let it sit. Each time, I chose differently. Not perfectly. But intentionally. And intention, I was learning, is what rewires a life. Freedom doesn't arrive all at once. It seeps in through tiny cracks you didn't notice until the light hits. I remember the first morning I realized I was no longer orchestrating my life around anyone else's expectations. The sunlight streamed across the kitchen counter, spilling over the mug Henry had loved, and for the first time, I didn't measure my morning by the pace of errands, phone calls, or obligations. I brewed coffee slowly, watching steam curl upward in the quiet room, and felt the weight of years I hadn't realized I'd carried fall gently away. I didn't rush. I didn't brace for judgment. I simply existed. And in that simple existence, I discovered something extraordinary: choice. The choice to linger over a song on the radio. The choice to step outside and notice the way the wind bent the maple branches. The choice to eat breakfast without a plan, without someone waiting for an answer, without a single responsibility that wasn't my own. I began noticing small delights I had long forgotten: the smell of rain hitting dry pavement, the warmth of a blanket against my legs, the quiet laughter of my daughter as she traced patterns in the sunlight. It felt indulgent, yes, but the indulgence wasn't in excess. It was in acknowledgement that my presence mattered. That my needs mattered. That I mattered. People began finding me not in moments of orchestrated help or guidance, but in quiet honesty. A neighbor, Ruth, came over one afternoon. She sat across from me, hands folded, eyes searching. She didn't need advice. She needed recognition. "I don't know how to stop carrying everything," she said. "It's like I have to hold the weight of everyone else's life on my shoulders." I nodded slowly. I didn't respond immediately. I let her feel the pause. Let the quiet become space she could breathe in. "Sometimes," I said finally, "things fall apart because they weren't yours to hold in the first place." Her shoulders eased just enough that I knew she was absorbing the lesson without needing me to explain it further. It struck me then, this was exactly what Henry had been teaching me all along, not through words, but through careful, quiet preparation. Freedom, he had taught me, is claimed slowly, patiently, and with consistency. Weeks passed. Months. Each day built upon the last, like layering soft light over a familiar wall. The house was no longer just a structure, it was a living reflection of my boundaries, my rhythms, my presence. I stopped rehearsing conversations with Carol. I stopped measuring Elaine's approval or disapproval. I stopped bracing for familial expectation as though it were an inevitable storm. And in that absence of anticipation, life appeared in its simplest, truest form, unremarkable, yet beautiful. One evening, I walked to the river alone. The city lights shimmered against the water, echoing the warmth of a life I had slowly reclaimed. I felt no tension. No obligation. Just the pulse of my own breath, the quiet understanding that my past no longer dictated my every movement. I didn't need affirmation. I didn't need applause. I didn't need revenge or closure. I had discovered something stronger, autonomy. I never imagined freedom would feel like this. Not loud. Not triumphant. Not marked by celebrations or announcements. It felt like the quiet settling of sunlight across the living room floor, the way shadows softened without effort. It felt like breathing without bracing, like walking through my own home without expecting judgment in every corner. Elaine stopped calling. Carol's messages became sparse. I no longer measured life by their presence or absence. And yet, the house, the city, the life I had built, they were mine. Not because anyone acknowledged it, but because I had claimed it. I thought often about Henry. About the way he had protected me quietly, deliberately, with trust instead of fanfare. About the life he had imagined for me, a life of choice, autonomy, and dignity. Now, I was living it. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't demand recognition. I simply existed fully in my own truth, and that, I realized, was the rarest kind of victory. The maple tree Henry planted still swayed in the yard, its leaves catching the light just as they always had. I paused beneath it one morning, hands resting on the rough bark, and felt a deep, unwavering calm. I had survived grief. I had navigated betrayal. I had set boundaries where none existed before. I had learned to distinguish between solitude and loneliness, and I had learned how to rest in both. And finally, I understood something that had eluded me for far too long. Life isn't about what is given or taken. It's about what you cultivate, protect, and allow to grow quietly inside you. I smiled softly, feeling the warmth of sunlight, the pulse of my own heartbeat, and the gentle authority of my own presence. The house was still standing, the city still humming around me, but the most important space, the one I had been reclaiming all along, was inside me. And in that quiet, enduring alignment, I was free. Not because the past had changed. Not because anyone had acknowledged me. But because I had stopped waiting. I had claimed myself. And that was enough.